In 165 AD, a virus escaped from a desecrated tomb in Parthia, now modern-day Iran, and swept across the Roman Empire, evolving into a pandemic that killed tens of thousands of people and almost destroyed the city of Rome, as well as myself. How exactly do I know this? Well, I'm your host, Marcus Aurelius, and as it happened, I was emperor at the time of this catastrophe. As you will soon see, this particular pandemic, otherwise known as the Antonine Plague, would also claim my own life in the year 180 AD. I guess you could say that I'm speaking to you from beyond the grave. Lucky you. By the end of this video, you'll understand how I, Marcus Aurelius, watched helplessly as this cursed virus became my worst enemy, silent, deadly, and completely unstoppable. I'll tell you how this ancient disease spread across the empire, killing almost 2,000 people per day in Rome alone, and how it forced me to make decisions that would fundamentally change the course of Western civilization. You'll learn how I had to recruit slaves and gladiators to fill the ranks of my decimated legions, and how I turned to Stoic philosophy to find meaning in the face of unimaginable suffering. So settle in and let me tell you the story of how I, the so-called philosopher-emperor, learned that some enemies cannot be defeated with weapons, but only endured with wisdom. Hence why I wrote my meditations, and I will finish this video with a quote that got through the darkest of my times. Chapter 1. The Curse Unleashed. To understand how this plague nearly toppled my empire, you need to know that I wasn't ruling alone. I shared power with my adoptive brother, Lucius Verus. Imagine having a co-CEO, except instead of running a company, you're running half the known world. In 165 AD, while I was busy with philosophical contemplations and governance in Rome, Lucius was off fighting the Parthians in the east. The story goes that during the siege of Seleucia, Lucius's soldiers desecrated a sacred tomb, unleashing what the locals called a curse. Now, as a Stoic philosopher, I should tell you that I don't believe in supernatural curses, but I do believe in consequences, and the consequence of that campaign was that my soldiers brought home something far deadlier than Parthian gold. Whether or not you believe in ancient curses, what's undeniable is that Roman soldiers encountered something deadly in the east and brought it home with them. When Lucius returned to Rome, he brought with him not just victory, but death itself. The irony wasn't lost on me. We went east to expand our empire, and instead, we imported our own destruction. Chapter 2. The perfect storm consumes my empire. The plague erupted in 165 CE, just as my empire was reaching its zenith. I called it the height of Roman power, but it turned out to be the perfect storm for a pandemic. Our extensive trade routes, our crowded cities, our armies constantly on the move. Everything that made Rome great also made it vulnerable. My famous road system, usually celebrated as one of engineering's greatest achievements, became highways of death. Every merchant, every soldier, every government official unknowingly became a potential carrier. It was like having a massive, ancient version of your modern airport system, except instead of delayed flights and overpriced food, you got a deadly plague spreading at the speed of commerce. The symptoms were horrific. Patients presented with fever, skin eruptions that turned red and black, diarrhea, and coughing that seemed to tear them apart from the inside. Galen, my court physician, described it as resembling smallpox, but worse. Imagine having all the symptoms of the worst flu you've ever experienced, combined with your skin breaking out in painful sores. It was like watching the gods themselves wage war on human flesh. The disease spread with terrifying efficiency. This first phase would last until my death in 180 CE, ravaging the entirety of my empire for 15 years. To put that in perspective, imagine dealing with a crisis for 15 years straight. No respite, no end in sight. Just death and suffering stretching on like an endless winter. Chapter 3. Watching my empire crumble before my eyes. The numbers still haunt me, even now. Dio Cassius estimated 2,000 deaths per day in Rome at the height of the outbreak. That's losing an entire small town every single day in my capital alone. I would wake up each morning to reports of fresh casualties, knowing that by sunset, 2,000 more souls would have departed this world. The mortality rate reached about 25% in some areas. Try to imagine that. 1 in 4 people you knew, gone. Your baker, your neighbor, your senators, your soldiers, vanished. It's like someone decided to randomly delete a quarter of humanity, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Historians now estimate that around 7 to 10% of my entire empire perished from this plague. That's millions upon millions of lives lost under my watch. As emperor, I was supposed to protect my people. But how do you protect them from an enemy you cannot see, cannot fight, and cannot negotiate with? The plague was so indiscriminate that it even reached the highest levels of power. My co-emperor Lucius Verus died in 169, possibly from the plague, and eventually it would claim my own life in 180 AD. When even the most powerful men in the world, with access to the best medical care available, couldn't escape this disease, you know you're facing something beyond human control. Chapter 4. How the social fabric of Rome unraveled. Watching my empire's social structure collapse was like watching a master weaver's tapestry unravel thread by thread. The plague decimated the aristocracy to such a degree that town councils struggled to meet, local magistracies went unfilled, and entire communities simply ceased to function. Picture this. You're an emperor, and suddenly the people who have run your local governments for generations are either dead or dying. No mayors, no city councils, no one to collect taxes or maintain order. The machinery of empire, built over centuries, was grinding to a halt because there was simply no one left to operate it. The social implications were staggering. Some areas lost 2/3 of their population. 2/3. Imagine if tomorrow only 1 in 3 people showed up to work, to the forum, to anywhere. The Roman world, famous for its social gatherings and public life, became a realm of ghosts. Families were torn apart, communities dissolved, and entire ways of life disappeared. The dinner parties, the public games, the bustling forums, all of it withered away. My empire, which had prided itself on civilization and social order, was reduced to a collection of survivors trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. Chapter 5. My military nightmare. As emperor, perhaps nothing was more devastating than watching my legendary legions crumble. The ancient chroniclers describe the plague as reducing the army almost to extinction. These weren't just soldiers. They were the backbone of Roman power, the men who had conquered the known world. The plague decimated their ranks just as the Marcomannic Wars began, with Germanic tribes invading Roman territory. It was like being challenged to a duel while suffering from a mortal illness. The enemy wasn't going to wait for us to recover. Facing this crisis, I had to make decisions that would have been unthinkable in better times. I recruited slaves and gladiators to fill the ranks of my legions. Think about that. The proud Roman military, with its centuries of tradition and discipline, was now filled with men who had been considered the lowest of society just months before. This hastily assembled army lacked the professionalism of the older Roman legions, and for the first time in over 200 years, barbarians set foot on Roman territory. It was a blow to our prestige that echoed across the empire. The invincible Roman military machine had been brought low by an enemy it couldn't fight. Chapter 6. Rome's Economic Collapse. The economic devastation was unlike anything Rome had ever experienced. When you lose that many people, you don't just lose consumers. You lose the farmers who feed the empire, the craftsmen who build it, the traders who connect it. The Roman economy, which had been the envy of the ancient world, suddenly ground to a halt. Tax revenues plummeted, not just because there were fewer people to tax, but because the survivors had little left to be taxed on. As emperor, I found myself in the impossible position of needing to fund military campaigns and relief efforts, while my treasury was bleeding gold, faster than a punctured wineskin. I had to make the difficult decision to debase the currency, reducing the silver content in our coins to stretch our resources. It was the ancient equivalent of printing money during a recession, necessary for survival, but with consequences that would ripple through the empire for generations. I even had to invite migrants from outside the empire to settle within our boundaries, filling the abandoned farmsteads and depopulated cities with foreigners. Imagine having to repopulate your own empire with outsiders. It was both pragmatic and deeply humbling. Chapter 7. How I dealt with this dark side of nature. Now you might wonder how I, as an emperor, coped with watching my world collapse around me. The answer lies in the philosophy that had guided me long before I ever wore the purple. Stoicism. In my meditations, I reminded myself, do not disturb yourself by thinking of your whole life. Don't let your thoughts, all at once, embrace all the various troubles which may befall you, but on every occasion ask yourself, what is there in this which is intolerable and past bearing? This wasn't mere philosophical musing, it was a survival strategy. Every morning, I would face reports of fresh catastrophes, new deaths, collapsed cities. The temptation was to be overwhelmed by the sheer scope of the disaster. Instead, I forced myself to focus on what could be controlled, what could be endured, what could be learned. I wrote in my meditations that a disease like the plague can only threaten your life, but evil, selfishness, pride, hypocrisy, fear, these things attack our humanity. In the face of physical death, I became more concerned with moral death, the collapse of virtue, honor, and duty that could destroy the soul of Rome, even if some Romans survived. I established relief programs where possible, organized the recruitment of new soldiers, and worked to maintain some semblance of order. But perhaps most importantly, I tried to model the Stoic virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. If the emperor could remain steadfast in the face of catastrophe, perhaps others could find the strength to do the same. I wrote that the destruction of understanding is a pestilence, much more indeed than any such corruption and change of this atmosphere which surrounds us. For me, the greater danger wasn't the physical plague, but the spiritual and intellectual plague of despair, ignorance, and moral collapse. Chapter 8. The Transformation of Faith. One of the most unexpected consequences of the plague was its impact on Roman religion. When the traditional gods fail to protect you from devastating pestilence, people begin to question everything they once believed. It's like watching your most trusted advisor repeatedly give you terrible counsel. Eventually, you start looking for new advisors. Christianity, with its emphasis on caring for the sick and its promise of eternal life, became increasingly attractive to people living through what felt like the end of the world. While many Romans fled from the plague victims, Christians stayed to care for them. This act of courage and compassion didn't go unnoticed by the survivors. As a Stoic, I found myself oddly sympathetic to some Christian teachings, even as I remained committed to traditional Roman values. Both philosophies emphasized virtue, duty, and the importance of serving something greater than oneself. The plague created a spiritual crisis that would outlast any physical recovery. Chapter 9. The Long Shadow. The plague that began in 165 CE marked the end of what historians now call the Pax Romana, the golden age of peace and prosperity that had defined my empire. It was the beginning of the decline that would eventually lead to Rome's fall centuries later. Historian Cassius Dio later wrote about me. He did not meet with the good fortune that he deserved, for he was not strong in body and was involved in a multitude of troubles throughout practically his entire reign. But for my part, I admire him all the more for this. That assessment captures the essence of my reign. It wasn't the glorious triumph I had hoped for, but perhaps it was something more valuable, a lesson in how to maintain dignity and purpose in the face of overwhelming adversity. The empire I passed to my son Commodus was fundamentally different from the one I had inherited. It was smaller, weaker, more fragmented, and more defensive. But it was also more resilient, more adaptive, and in some ways more humane. The plague had stripped away many of our illusions about Roman invincibility, but it had also revealed our capacity for survival and renewal. Chapter 10. My Final Reflections and Meditations. As I lay dying in 180 AD, likely from the very plague that had ravaged my empire, I reflected on the 15 years of crisis that had defined my reign. The plague had taken my co-emperor, my soldiers, my subjects, and eventually it would take me. But it had not taken the essence of what made Rome great, the capacity to endure, to adapt, and to find meaning in suffering. The universe had chosen to test the stoicism for which I was known, and while I may not have emerged victorious in the conventional sense, I had learned something invaluable. That true strength isn't measured by the absence of suffering, but by how we respond to it. The plague taught me that even the mightiest empires are vulnerable to forces beyond their control. We Romans thought we had conquered the world, but we discovered that some enemies can't be defeated with legions and engineering. Sometimes the greatest threats come from the smallest sources. Yet perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Antonine Plague isn't its destructive power, but what it revealed about human resilience. Despite losing millions of people, despite watching our world turned upside down, Romans found ways to survive and adapt. We rebuilt our communities, reformed our institutions, and laid the groundwork for the world that would follow. Conclusion: how my meditations helped me through the Antonine Plague stands as one of history's most devastating pandemics, and I, Marcus Aurelius, was the man who had to guide Rome through its darkest hour. This plague was truly the world's first pandemic, and its effects rippled through history long after my death. From its mysterious origins in the East to its devastating impact on Roman society, the plague demonstrates how quickly even the mightiest civilization can be brought to its knees. It killed emperors and peasants alike, collapsed armies, destroyed economies, and transformed the religious landscape of the ancient world. But if you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Even in the face of unimaginable catastrophe, the human spirit endures. I watched my empire lose millions of people, saw my entire world turned upside down, and yet somehow we found ways to survive and rebuild. We adapted our institutions, recruited new soldiers from unexpected sources, and discovered strength we didn't know we possessed. The next time you face overwhelming challenges, remember this emperor who ruled through 15 years of plague without modern medicine, without government support systems, and without the comfort of knowing that science would eventually find a cure. We faced the end of our world with nothing but our own courage, philosophy, and determination. And somehow, we endured. The Antonine Plague may have nearly destroyed the Roman Empire, but it couldn't destroy the human capacity for resilience, adaptation, and hope. And in that, perhaps, lies the most important lesson of all. As I wrote in my meditations, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The plague took my empire, my people, and eventually my life. But it could not take the lessons learned, the wisdom gained, or the example set for future generations facing their own impossible challenges. If you liked this video, then please like and subscribe to this channel. That way you will never miss another episode of Ancient Rome Revisited. Here are 2 other videos that you might also like. The Roman army's worst military defeat, in which I explain the devastating battle in the Teutoburg forest against the barbarian hordes, and 15 weapons of war that were used by the Roman army for defeating the barbarian hordes. And you can click on the red SPQR symbol to subscribe as well. I'll see you in the other videos.